How many wars has Israel been in, and what might be coming next? Hi, I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News. From the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, Israel has been involved in wars. We had the War of Independence, in which 5 Arab nations attacked Israel on May 14th, 1948, when the Jewish people declared their independence from the British and declared their own sovereign state after centuries in exile, having had sovereign states back in biblical times, right? So that was the 1948 war. Israel won, but in 1956, Israel was then in a war with Egypt. 1967, Israel was in a war with Egypt and Syria and Jordan. That was 1967. From 1967 to 1973, we called it the War of Attrition. All kinds of terrorists coming and trying to attack and murder Israelis. In 1973, Egypt and Syria did a sneak invasion on the highest holy day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. That's known as the Yom Kippur War, and almost wiped Israel out. But Israel, at the last minute, was able to turn the tide, win the war, but at great cost to it. That was so 1948, 1956, 1967, 67 through 70, 73. Then we had the first peace treaty. Egypt decided to make peace with Israel in 1979, actually 1977 even. Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat, who had ordered the attack against Israel in 73, now by September of 77, he came here to Jerusalem on a dramatic, monumental visit in which he offered his hand of peace just several years after trying to destroy Israel. And that set into motion the Camp David peace process, and we have peace now with Israel and with Egypt, and that was settled in 1979. But that was not the end of the wars, unfortunately. In 1982, Israel moved into southern Lebanon. Why? Because the Palestine Liberation Organization, known as the PLO, headed up by terrorist Yasser Arafat, kept sending his forces, his terrorist forces, to attack Israelis living along that Israeli-Lebanon border. So Israel invaded to try to tamp down or even destroy the PLO. The operation was led by then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon. Sharon, however, went beyond what the Israeli cabinet originally planned to do. He took Israeli military forces all the way up to the borders of the capital city of Lebanon, which is known as Beirut. Eventually Israel pulled back to southern Lebanon, but that bogged Israel down for 20 years in what many Israelis came to believe was Israel's own Vietnam War. I wish I could say that was all of the wars, but there were others. Israel had to attack in 1982 an Iraqi nuclear facility. It didn't start a war, but it did create a lot of tension because there was a fear that Saddam Hussein was going to use that nuclear facility to build nuclear weapons to attack Israel. Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, August 2nd of 1990. And the United States and many countries in the Middle East and Europe and all built up a force to liberate the Arab country of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein and push Iraqi forces back into southern Iraq. But as President George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, set into motion Operation Desert Storm, Iraq decided to open up a front with Israel, firing 39 ballistic missiles, known as Scud missiles, here at Israel. Israel, of course, was ready to go attack Iraq, Saddam's forces, in retaliation and to show that nobody could attack Israel with impunity. But the United States begged, pleaded, pressured Israel, don't get involved in this war or Saddam will achieve his objective. He will have changed this from it being about him and his rape and pillaging of a neighboring Arab state, Kuwait. It will change into an Arab-Israeli conflict. And President Bush said, that is not what you want. And Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, to his credit, I believe, not everybody believes that, but I do, that he probably was right to let the American and allied forces deal with Saddam, and Israel held back. Very, very difficult decision for him to make. Then we had intifadas. We had uprisings in the West Bank, in Gaza. Sadly, the story goes on. But the question becomes then, what might happen next? By the way, there was probably the biggest war recently has been the rocket wars from Gaza. Well over 15,000 rockets have been fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Even though Israel completely withdrew all of its soldiers and all of its settlers out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. Nevertheless, the Hamas terrorist force took over the Gaza Strip once Israel evacuated and used it as a launching pad against Israel. And then, of course, I should note the 2006 war, known as the Second Lebanon War, in which Hezbollah forces, a terrorist organization, Hezbollah, which is founded, funded, armed, trained, supported by Iran, decided to attack a group of Israeli soldiers on that border. That set into a motion of big conflagration. In the end, Lebanon fired 4,000 rockets and missiles at the people of Israel, forcing 1 million Israelis living in the north to live underground in bomb shelters or retreat southward to stay in homes of friends or stay in motels or what have you. This has been one round after another. The question is what's coming. And I would say there are two big threats emerging. There are obviously, anything can happen at any time, but the two big threats right now would be a third Lebanon war in which the forces of Hezbollah, again, the Iranian terror force, could end up deciding to launch an attack against Israel. They now have estimates, I've seen estimates of 150,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon aimed at Israel, which would be far worse of an attack, with just missiles raining down on Israel every moment of every day. It would be far worse than 2006. It hasn't happened yet. We pray that it won't, but that is a real concern on that northern border. The biggest threat, of course, is the threat of Iran, that Iran would get nuclear weapons, the long-range missiles to reach Israel. They already have those, but they also are working on intercontinental ballistic missiles in which Iran could then reach the United States. This is a worst-case scenario. This raises the prospect of a second Holocaust. This is what Israel most fears, and this is what Israel's leaders are working so closely with the Trump administration, but now with the Biden administration, trying to figure out how can we as a global community, not just Israel, but the global community, put so much pressure on Iran that Iran would give up its nuclear ambitions. This is why we have to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We would love to say that the Abraham Accords and all of our new peace treaties with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco was the end of the story, but it's not. Yes, we now have 6 total deals, those 4 plus Egypt and Jordan. Israel's living more securely today than it ever has before. However, we have major threats, strategic threats really, from Lebanon, not the Lebanese people, but the terrorist forces of Hezbollah, and of course not from the Iranian people, but from the terror leaders in Iran. And this is why we have to keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem for All Israel News. Thanks for watching.